Welcome everyone today to IIRSM Southeast Branch meeting. My name is Julie and I'm here representing IIRSM. We're lucky to have with us today Peter Jenkins, who's the Senior Partner for Risk Fluent. So over to you, Peter, for your presentation.
Perfect stuff. Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. So I can see that people are kind of drifting in at the moment just as we're going through stuff. My name is Peter Jenkins, and as Julie's just introduced there, I'm the Senior Partner at Risk Fluent. So we are a transformational and technical consultancy that I'll kind of touch upon in a few minutes' time. But what are we here to do today? Well, today we're going to have a chat about implementing effective health and safety management systems. Ultimately, this is for businesses that have got kind of a sole trader element to them, all the way through to businesses that are nationwide or prospectively international with tens of thousands of employees. And hopefully the frameworks that we talk about, the information that we share is going to be really useful for you. So if you wouldn't mind, feel free to message in the chat, let me know who you are, where you come from today. And if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A and I'll hopefully answer them either as we're going through, or if we need to kind of put a pause on them, we'll put them in a little car park until the end of the session where we can have a little bit more of a conversation. Okay, so in terms of Risk Fluent then, a little bit about us first of all. So the business is split across three different areas. The first one is a risk assessment app called Risk Assessor Pro. The second one is then the actual core part of the business, which is Risk Fluent. Now, as I say, that's a technical and transformational consultancy. Everything from simply doing things like fire risk assessments all the way through to doing things like transformational change for safety culture, really focusing on safety as an outcome of operational excellence. And then the last part you might actually be familiar with if you know a chap called James McPherson, who I'll kind of touch upon in a second. But he's run the podcast Rebranding Safety, which is literally part of the Risk Fluent kind of business structure. He's been doing that for many years, and hopefully a couple of you are a fan of the podcast as well. Now, there's a small element of social awkwardness that comes into talking about the various kind of awards that the business has won before, but fundamentally, what we're really aiming for through the work that we do is to make sure that our customers' awards are very much front and center of what we're doing in the future. The senior team then, so James is our manager, he's the founder of Sherry, who is the operations director, and then come to me, who's a staff. Now, I've been with as a consultancy for about now kind of 6 months or so. Before that, I was head of safety at Stagecoach. Now, that's a business with roughly about 120 different locations. We've got roughly approximately, well, I think there was about 22 to 23,000 staff at that particular time, 18 different operating companies, each kind of structured with their own relevant legal structure. Now, before that, I was group health and safety manager at a company, TL. This was a food manufacturer, dry spice blend manufacturing, along with the storage and the kind of distribution of chilled, ambient and frozen foodstuffs. Roughly about 750 staff, 3 business divisions and about 18 sites spread literally from the top of the country down to the bottom, which being based in Leeds was perfect for me because I was kind of smack in the middle of everything. Throughout my career, I've really tried to deliver on that mantra of safety as an outcome of operational excellence. And that's really underpinned a lot of the solutions that I've tried for businesses and really linked to a lot of the scalability behind what I do. Fundamentally, when you work in a business that has got kind of multiple different sites, you've got almost 2 simultaneous tiers of health and safety management system that you're trying to sort. You're trying to sort kind of group-wide picture with all of those different sites, all the business divisions, but then you're also trying to deliver a health and safety management system that works at a really fundamentally small level. It works for the businesses that you're actually dealing with within that larger organization. So within DL, for example, when I had 18 sites, the smallest actual site only had roughly about 12 people in it, whereas the largest one, roughly about 180. So really trying to kind of have a single management system that could stretch, it could scale, it could have the resilience for that was absolutely key for me. So in terms of kind of Risk Fluent's particular purpose and values, so what we want to do, I say, is for that operational excellence piece, but the values are very much focused on practicality, pragmatism, authenticity, transparency, and making sure that what we do is people-centered. So what we mean by that is fundamentally people do safety. I think that's kind of it. People come to work to do literally what they've been paid to do. What we want to make sure, though, is that they're doing that in the safest way possible that works for the business. So it makes sense that rather than necessarily solely focusing on processes, solely focusing on structure, we're really putting people at the heart of what we do. Now, if you bear with me a second, I believe that my signal's starting to go a little bit. If you completely lose my voice, if you just let me know in the chat, that would be much appreciated. Okay, so what are we going to do today in a little bit more detail then? Well, we're going to go through about 4 different key objectives. But I'm really keen to share with you the foundational frameworks that I've used throughout my career. These are frameworks that have allowed me to scale what I do from a very small business, that's kind of like a single site point of view, all the way through to that kind of 24,000 staff operation with loads of different operating companies and legal structures. I want to help talk through what type of frameworks you might be able to use that could actually have the most impact for where you're working and what you're trying to do in safety. We're going to have a little bit of a chat about how you can use Microsoft to help you do that. So from my point of view, being from kind of Yorkshire originally, I'm not going to say that I fit in the Yorkshire trope here of trying to do stuff on the cheap, but fundamentally, if I've got something that works, it's free, and fundamentally, it's going to deliver on the outcomes and the outputs that I'm after, why not use it? Microsoft fit the bill incredibly well over the years for helping me structure these health and safety management systems and deliver some fantastic outcomes as well as outputs for the business. So hopefully I can share these with you and you can see kind of how they work and what might work specifically for you in your business. And finally, I'm going to take you through something called process mapping exercise, which should hopefully help you understand how we can critique and structure our health and safety processes to be the most effective and efficient versions of them possible. And this uses kind of a particular technique that really fits quite nicely into what I'm going to show for Microsoft. So, as I say, if you've got any questions, anything you kind of want to ask while we're going through, feel free to pop a message in the chat or pop a message down in the Q&A section, and I'll get to it as soon as I possibly can. So the first things first, basically, is we want to think about workers done versus workers imagined, and health and safety management systems as imagined versus as done. So I've got a little question that I want to kind of pop into the chat and get to see if this can work. So hopefully, if you can all nip to the chat for a second, and then see if you can just quickly follow this particular link. So if you want to click that link for a second and just fill in these 2 questions, I'm really curious to know basically what have you built your health and safety management system around, and is your health and safety management system working effectively? So I'm going to fill this in as well so you can hopefully see these answers change in real time as we're going through, fingers crossed. I'll just give you a quick minute just to sort that out. Let me know again if in the chat if you've got any challenges with that, if you can't kind of access it for a second. Oh no, we don't have permission to view the form. Right, apologies. Oh no, well that's completely gone a bit awry for a second then. Okay, right. We'll give that one a little bit of a miss then. Right, no, I appreciate that. So Chris, Margot, I really appreciate, and Peter, I really appreciate you doing that. So I tell you what, in the chat then, if you just let me know, what have you got your current health and safety management system around? Is it 18,001, 45,001? Is it bespoke? Or currently don't you have kind of a structured health and safety management system? I just want to quickly pop a message in the chat, that'd be great. So bespoke, right, perfect. Yeah. All right, so predominantly we're looking at a mixture of kind of bespoke and 45,001. So what I'll do is we're kind of going through, I'll try and talk through how we can kind of apply a lot of these different principles to our health and safety management systems. Right. So this is going to be a little bit for a second, but Deepwater Horizon. Now, this is something in safety that we've talked a little bit about before now as a profession. It's quite a famous example of a couple of safety challenges that have occurred. But as a quick question for you, there were 2 BP execs on that on Deepwater Horizon on the day of the event. And I'm curious to know, what those BP execs were there. So if you pop a message in the chat again, see if you can pop down just 1, 2, 3, or 4. What do you think? I can see that someone's got the answer straight away without even getting onto the slide. But if you want to drop me a message, say, what do you think? Do you think that they were there for assessing the production rates of the rig? Do you think they were doing a leadership tour? Were they sorting out an ongoing issue, or were they presenting a safety award? What do you reckon? So I've got a couple of answers coming through now. Yeah, nice one. I see what a lot of you are very familiar with this one already, which is brilliant. So yeah, absolutely right. We absolutely presenting a safety award, and if I'm not mistaken, safety award for lost time injury free rates actually on the water horizon. And I want to say that it'd been roughly about 7 years that they were celebrating at the time, so they hadn't had any lost time events. Unfortunately, it was that day that we're now all familiar with where the Deepwater Horizon explosion occurred. So fundamentally, the best will in the world, we can have all of this work that we think is going really well because our numbers are telling us that actually things are going okay. But the reality of the work as it's actually happening is completely different. And for us, our health and safety management systems are exactly the same. We can have a wonderful health and safety management system on paper, but actually in practice, it just doesn't work effectively. So fundamentally, why does this happen? Why do health and safety management systems occasionally have such a gap between them from as imagined through to as done? Well, for a lot of people, it comes down to the structures and the frameworks that are in place around them, especially those that don't necessarily allow for full feedback loops that gives them answers that might be difficult to hear, but fundamentally answers that they need to hear when it comes around to an effective health and safety management system. So what I'm going to take you through now are some of the foundational frameworks that you can potentially put in place to help bridge that gap between health and safety management systems as imagined versus having ones that work really well as done. And I'll put a bit of business context behind them for how I've used these in the past as well. So the first one is probably my favorite framework, and it's the one that I kind of always start with whenever I've gone into a business. It's called organizational architecture. Now, as a quick book recommendation, if any of you haven't come across the first 90 days before, I would highly recommend that you go out and you get it from Amazon or the bookstore that you want to get it from. It's a wonderful book that was recommended to me by a chap called John Boyle, who's a director within health and safety, predominantly in the food manufacturing industry. But within that book, they talk about organizational architecture and they use a few examples. But for me in health and safety, it's been really useful. It's not necessarily like a linear circle, like plan, do, check, act is. You don't need to kind of linearly go from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. But realistically, we do really want to consider how we can use this to the most effect. So if we were to start with strategic direction, it basically includes our mission, which is what we do, our vision, which is why we do it, and our strategy, which is how do we actually do it. We want to understand the structure that exists around what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to implement and do. How is that work organized? Basically, what's the coordination like behind it? How are we measuring what we do? How are we incentivizing what we do across either a single site or a group? Now, from a skills basis point of view, often we don't necessarily think about the full training needs analysis across core skills, behavioral skills, and specific technical skills that we need our staff to have. I'm sure that a few of you have kind of been in a position where you've applied for a different job and they've gone, hey, development's really important for us, really keen to develop you as a health and safety professional. But when you actually get into the role itself, the development plan kind of completely disappears and you never have a conversation again about it. And anything that you do try and do from a development point of view, it has to come from yourself. There's not a lot of kind of top-down support. So again, from a skills basis point of view, we want to think in the same way about our health and safety management system. Are we mapping out, for example, what the training needs are for individual roles against our topical responsibilities and our topical arrangements? Does that actually fit into an analysis of that particular role before the person's actually got into the business? Have we actually used the interview to map out where their competency deficiencies lie in order for us to make sure that they're delivering the best possible outcomes through developing them when they actually get into the business? And finally, what are our core processes? So this is specifically where a lot of our management system processes and policies exist. When I went into DL, which was that kind of food manufacturer that had sort of the 18 different sites, the 3 business divisions, from a health and safety management system point of view, actually it was a lot more effective for me to not necessarily focus on the paperwork side to start with. Don't get me wrong, it was still really important, but actually make sure that the processes that people were engaging with were as effective as possible straight away. And I actually split that down into 4 different key ones. So I started with accident investigations, that's accident notification and accident investigation, hazard near missing incident notification and recording, action tracking, and a training matrix. And those were the top 4 things that I put into every single one of the 18 sites straight away. Because fundamentally between that, the key 4 things I needed to make sure that we had as a business were information, instruction, supervision, and training. Fundamentally, the 4 key bits that the Health and Safety at Work Act asks for. So it makes sense in some respects. Yes, our paperwork arrangements need to be there, but a good paperwork arrangement doesn't necessarily make a safe business. Having processes that are in place at documenting what you're doing, how you're doing it, when you're doing it, who's doing it, are really, really effective for making sure that you've just got immediate control over a safety management system output and outcome right away. And it seems a little bit odd to kind of on doing the process side before the paperwork side from an arrangement point of view. But fundamentally, in my experience of kind of working with the HSE, we really want to make sure that we've got the proof in what our outcomes are and what our outputs are as much as that kind of paperwork bit. And fundamentally, they're going to want to see more evidence that comes with those outputs and outcomes rather than necessarily just in the core arrangement in place, but then nothing else. You know, it'd be the type of thing that if you sit down with a managing director or a chairman, sorry, excuse me, one second. Sorry, thank you. If you sit down with a managing director or chairman and you say, right, I can give you a new policy once a week for 52 weeks, and we'll cover all the topics in this business, but we're not actually implementing the associated actions with them, the paperwork's quite pointless in some respects because we're not actually delivering safety. So organizational architecture is fundamentally a wonderful tool to use to make sure that we're just hitting all of those particular points that we want to fulfill the Health and Safety Work Act requirements. Now, while I've been talking about this, you'll have seen that I've omitted kind of the big one in the middle, which is culture. And this is a little bit of a strange one for a second, because as a business, we need to ask ourselves, do we want a safe culture or do we want a business culture that embraces safety? And actually, a lot of the times, we want to have the latter. We don't want to have a siloed divide where people are doing kind of stuff for an operational business culture point of view, but then they have to get themselves in a mindset of the safety culture. It's a 2-tiered system that fundamentally doesn't integrate well together. So when it comes down to using organizational architecture, we want to think about how are people actually doing the job that we've paid them to do in a safe way. And I know that sounds really simple, but a lot of the time, the scalability challenges with health and safety management systems come into play, where they're seen as completely independent of that business culture. So I say organizational architecture is a really useful tool for that. The First 90 Days is a wonderful book that kind of talks about this in a little bit more detail. So the second framework that I'd like to talk about is one that's specifically from Risk Fluent, and this is the framework for operational success. There's actually going to be a little bit of kind of a feedback survey at the end of this, and if you'd like kind of a copy of the framework for operational success, there's a digital download that you'll get if you just fill in that feedback form. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be absolutely spot on. But fundamentally, this particular framework focuses on 4 key foundations: reliability, organizational learning, human performance, and culture, which supports reliability, the foundations, reliability, organizational learning, human performance, and culture, but with fundamental supports that are in them. So for example, within reliability, that's where we look at risk management, resilience, and risk-based thinking. So this kind of helps us understand actually if we're focusing on the 4 key foundations, what do we actually need to consider to actually deliver on those? What makes up human performance? What makes up culture? And actually, how can we start to work backward to make sure that we are effectively managing operational success and safety within our organization? Rather than go into a huge amount of detail on this now, as I say, there's a digital download that's available at the end of the session. So the next framework that I've kind of talked through is one, again, that's really close to my heart, which is objectives, strategy, tactics, tasks. Now, this is actually something that I got from a particular webinar that was done on the High Performance podcast. So again, if you haven't watched kind of the High Performance podcast, I'd highly recommend it. But objective, strategy, tactics, task is one of the most useful tools for structuring health and safety management system implementation that I've come across. It's very easy when we come into a business for the first time and we're trying to transform safety through safety management systems to get caught up on objectives that are too lofty, that aren't particularly very smart, that don't necessarily work in the best way. Now, when I went into my company's kind of group health and safety manager, I took one of these objectives as a kind of a key one, which was that sites need to always use a digital accident process when an employer liability accident occurs on the site. But to help with this, I really needed to streamline the strategy around two key areas: simplification and standardization, making life easy for everyone to do and making life the same for all of the sites to undertake it. Sorry, excuse me. The tactics that were associated with that, though, needed to be quite clear and quite easy to understand. I'm very sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Just bear with me 1 second. Sorry, thank you. So if we think about the strategy for tactics, then for sites always using a digital accident process, the trouble that I had when I went into the company's group health and safety manager is that the level of digital literacy was quite low. So I needed to try and do two key things. The first one was to de-skill the task to a point that the barriers to completing it were as low as possible. And the second was to upskill the staff with their digital literacy. This was then supported by extrapolating indirect processes that they were already used to. So in a food manufacturing business, actually what I found is that people were really clear and understanding of food safety and food quality controls. And actually the language that they used was quite similar to health and safety. You know, they would do something called a HACCP plan, which is hazard analysis critical control points, which fundamentally is a process risk assessment on an end-to-end basis, from the time that the raw materials come into the business through to the time that it arrives at the customer. So actually, when it came around to talking about holistic risk management, actually talking about HACCP, talking about food safety and food quality and vulnerabilities and threats associated with that, meant that people actually understood health and safety a lot better. Don't get me wrong, they'd kind of had some exposure to health and safety before, but there hadn't been a lot of structure in place. So helping them understand what we were trying to achieve through applying it to food safety was a really good way into doing that. And you might actually find that if you've got existing management systems in your organization, be that 50,001, be that 9,001, or be even from an IT point of view, 27,001, similar kind of principles might already exist that you can link up to with health and safety to really help apply learnings to what you're trying to do from a simplified basis. From a standardization point of view, the two key things that I wanted to put in place were organizational architecture and governance. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't necessarily found over the years that there's a lot of health and safety qualifications that do a good job about talking about governance. It actually feels a little bit like kind of this blank sort of space in the development of health and safety, where there's little direction, there's little support of it. And I'll talk through the governance structure that I used in a few slides' time. But fundamentally, the other part of this was the digitization of processes and improving the digital literacy of the staff across the business. Now, you can see there how the tactics for simplification of upskilling staff and the tactics for standardization of improving digital literacy actually come together quite nicely to make sure that we're really achieving the strategies and ultimately achieving that objective. But again, if you've got a team of health and safety professionals across your group, and you're thinking, right, how can I track development of this health and safety management system? How can I prove that it's working? If you basically build your objectives against objective strategy, tactics, and tasks, you can start to measure and quantify your adherence to those individual tactics. So you might say, for example, that 50% of the tasks associated with de-skilling the task and upskilling the staff are complete. That means that fundamentally we've got 25% of the strategy completed for simplification, which means that we are 12.5% along the way to achieving our objective. So again, if you've got particularly kind of strong executive leadership teams that are demanding progress against your health and safety management system changes or implementation, structuring and measuring objective strategies, tactics, and tasks is a really key and effective way of being able to prove the work that you're doing and prove the value behind your approach, because you've always got something measurable behind it. So in terms of then the next particular framework, it's talking through the 3 E's. So this is very similar to what DuPont have used in the past, but fundamentally it's thinking at a broad level, so what we're going to do across the group, but then acting at an individual site level to make sure it works. We want to make sure that if we're linking this to objective, strategy, tactics, tasks, that we're being really clear with expectations that we're setting for success across each of these three bits. Not everything can be achieved at once. And I know that in safety, we're really keen on making sure that we're compliant 100% of the time. But the reality is, especially if we're going into a business where we are transforming or designing and implementing a new health and safety management system, that we're probably not going to be compliant for a few months at least while we get things properly in place. So setting expectations and linking them back to those strategies, tactics, and tasks, absolutely key. And where we see the benefit of splitting them out across the three E's is that it helps us with pragmatism and it helps us with the realism behind it. So when I tend to go into a business and I'm trying to transform safety, actually a lot of it's not really a solution stage. We might actually have to wind back a bit and go to establishing some core frameworks, some core principles that people really need to engage with. Think back to organizational architecture. Heck, it might be that we're actually having to establish structure, core processes, and skills bases right from the outset. So it's very difficult for us to come in and say, hey, yeah, we're going to evolve how you're doing things, because realistically, we might need to break everything down first before we can start rebuilding it back again. And having that kind of global picture in our mind while acting at an individual site level in the context of these three E's can again be really useful for setting expectations with our key stakeholders internally and externally. Again, this is something that comes from Risk Fluent, but it's a really kind of good visualization of a few of the different things that we've talked about so far, which is around how can we implement safety management systems and health and safety transformational change effectively. I really want to pick out one of these key bits on the right-hand side there, which focuses on time, quantity, quality, cost, capacity, culture, and capability. If we link that to kind of what we're seeing with organizational architecture, a lot of this is underpinned by the skills bases that people have. If we go into a business and we're saying, hey, yeah, we're going to give you a really exciting health and safety management system, it's going to work and it's going to take about kind of 3 months to do. We've never done a capability assessment of our doers across the site or the kind of senior management teams that are delivering them. We're never going to be able to progress as effectively as we could do. Time, quantity, quality, cost, capacity, and culture very much fit into that. Because fundamentally, if we're saying, hey, yeah, we've got a health and safety management system that we're going to implement, but the teams that need to do it, the operations teams, the supply chain teams, HR, quality, technical, you name it, don't have the capacity to even do the actions that we want them to do from a health and safety management system point of view. Again, it's simply just not going to work because no one has the capacity to do it. Where we've got quantity, cost, and quality, it's almost kind of thinking, right, okay, if we need people to do a particular topical action around our health and safety management system, but they don't necessarily have enough time to do it effectively, the quality might be lower. Or we might actually get fewer submissions, for example, of our accidents, our near misses, our hazards, or fundamentally, actually, we need to put some money in here to make life a bit easier for people to complete them, which again could improve the quality and the quantity without necessarily demanding more time to complete what's required. And again, you've got that real culture piece that's attached there that comes to the back of what is our business culture that very much underpins a lot of these particular processes as well. Again, if you'd like more information on the implementation framework, drop me a message at the end. I'd be more than happy to talk this through with you. I mentioned before about governance. Now, I don't know how many of you have got a governance structure or kind of a governance plan, but this is one that I've used before in several businesses. And it's quite simple, but it works really effectively. We kind of split out what we do in our health and safety management systems across kind of 5 particular areas. Proactive management, which focuses on kind of our risk management of topical risks. We focus on any compliance activities that we need to do. So that could be kind of statutory inspections across fixed wiring, fire, Lola, pure, all of the really kind of good stuff that we love in health and safety. We've got our reactive management to accidents, near misses, incidents, hazards that kind of come up through what we're doing. audits that can prove our relevant compliance if we need to, that's either done internally, externally by consultants, or from specialist providers. For example, that might be for noise audits, or for example, for dust audits that we want to get in, or specifically looking at something like volatile organic compounds. It can be very difficult for us to do as safety professionals if we don't have the competency to do it in-house. Our visual performance management is something that I'll touch upon in a second, but fundamentally, how are we actually showing what we're doing from both an action point of view, but also from these kind of reactive events that are happening? Now, that traditionally kind of fits into leading and lagging indicators, but what I want to say here is that have you got the right indicators out there, basically, for your health and safety management system stage? When I went into a business to establish a health and safety management system, I sat down with the MD and asked him a really simple question. I said, what do you want to know? Do you want to know the amount of accidents that we have in a month? Or do you want to know the amount of actions that the group is completing to stop the accidents from happening again? And he kind of paused for a second. He said, oh, Pete, can I have both? I said, yeah, absolutely, 100%. And a lot of our conversations were then steered not only by what had happened, but what we've done about it and what investment was specifically required across the group to stop it from happening again. And there was a couple of tools that I used to support that, including a civil claim liability matrix that helped, especially at the early stages, identify where a few of our critical gaps were, but then also talking about the legal compliance elements through proactive management that we were undertaking at the same time, following identified gaps on a risk profile activity that I'll show you in a few slides' time. Review mechanisms can be really difficult to kind of implement effectively. Now, what you can kind of see on the right is actually almost kind of a cascading set of review mechanisms that we have. Obviously, 45001 really champions sharing relevant information across the business. But actually, have we written down how the governance of these review mechanisms actually feed into each other? Are our meetings that happen at either a departmental level or a site level actually completely independent to what we have from an executive team level? Do we just have kind of a multi-tiered but siloed set of review mechanisms that don't actually speak to each other? So really kind of getting your governance kind of diagrams written down to start with can be a really effective way of planning for your health and safety management system, but also developing it in the future as well as your business scales and as your business grows. This is a really busy slide for a second, but what I really want to stress is that as part of our health and safety management systems, we need to get comfortable with risk. Upon this a little earlier on when I was talking about risk profiling. So when I've got into this to talk about health and safety management systems, one of the first things that I've done is kind of split it between technical risk and transformational risk, and actually get an A to Z breakdown of all of our different topics across the business and saying, right, what level of risk do we have with these? Is it a threatening risk? Is it an unacceptable risk? Is it a tolerable risk? Or is it an acceptable risk from where we are at the moment? Really helps steer a lot of the conversations we might need to do to better invest in our health and safety management systems and potentially across the function for the business. So I want to stress this is just a representative example. This isn't kind of based on anything real. It's just to kind of pick out what something might look like. But at a glance, if you're speaking to stakeholders at an early stage of your health and safety management system, and you're saying, right, we've got threatening issues across accidents, COSH, Lotto, Legionella, noise, and slips and trips. Perfect. You've got some immediate visual context to say, actually, what level of risk are we dealing with for everything else as well as this? So as something as simple as just visualizing your risk profiling activities can do wonders for establishing your health and safety management system and embedding the understanding of risk across your senior leadership teams so that you can progress with targeted objectives, strategies, and tactics for what you need to achieve and what you need to do. Kind of attached to that is where we can add additional value as a particular function or as a health and safety leader. And I want to stress that the best way of potentially thinking about this is breaking it down into three categories: inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So if we start, for example, with a really simple one here, accident reporting. Our accident report form is our input. Our output is the number of accidents that are happening across our business, but an outcome is associated with reducing the risk by completing actions associated with those accidents. So when we're trying to articulate the effectiveness of our health and safety management system and where we need to kind of go to design and implement it effectively, if we just keep in the back of our mind, what's the purpose behind this conversation I'm having? What do I want to achieve? What's my aim here? Is it to improve the inputs? Is it to improve the outputs? Or is it to improve the outcomes? Fundamentally, that can really help steer a lot of conversations about investment, about resourcing, about strategies, and fundamentally about where we need to go in what time frame to achieve an effective health and safety management system. If we've done that kind of risk profiling activity on an A to Z basis, we've really made sure that we're addressing both the technical needs and the transformational needs across our business. Fundamentally, if we're not tracking actions associated with these particular issues, it's very difficult in health and safety to feel like we're actually progressing anywhere. And it's very difficult for us to prove as well, especially for things like 45,001, that we are improving our health and safety management system. And although I'm kind of now in the world of consultancy, I've done a few 45,001 audits recently, and it's quite surprising actually how many people don't include health and safety management system improvement actions just from proactive analysis of their health and safety management system in their improvement logs, not in the non-conformance logs, but simply just in an improvement log. So it doesn't have to be really complex. If we've got a governance system that identifies a departmental meeting that then escalates up into a senior leadership team meeting that then escalates up into a group meeting, well, actually what we might find is that we can still track each of those individual tiers of actions in our improvement logs and prove that we're working forward in getting our inputs, outputs, and outcomes to where we need them. So what about digitization and automation then? Well, how can we do this effectively? There's a couple of tools to use. One of the key things that I want to kind of potentially take away from this is the power of data process mapping. Now, this is quite a complicated diagram that we've just got on the left here. It's called a data flow diagram. Genuinely, the best thing I can say here is just Google these at the end of this session. But the way that it's worthwhile thinking about is splitting out the process from the input point, which could be our form, through to the different steps that that data from that input form will take until it reaches the output or the outcome that we want to achieve. And this is a really good way of actually identifying what our knowns and unknowns are associated with these particular processes. So if I kind of do a very brief example for a second here, this is something I took a customer through recently. And it really shows a great difference between a simple process, a complicated process, and a complex process. So this actually was thought to be quite a simple process for doing a driver check, i.e., is the driver suitably licensed to drive the vehicles that we need them to drive in this operation? Now, when we kind of got down the process, we actually found that in reality, the complexity happened at one particular stage that you can kind of see where everything goes really horizontal. And actually, what we found is that through a lot of the previous steps, anything that you see in yellow is a dead end to that process. It's a point where the safety team actually had no engagement. They didn't have any touch points at that particular process. So when we linked it back to their 45,001 system, we talked about communication, we talked about improvement logs, and we talked about tracking actions. Actually, by just literally mapping out the process from point to point as far as the data goes, we discovered several opportunities for improvement to make sure that that loop was closed, so it fit a 45,001 management system better. And those you can kind of see in red. For reference, the points in green are actually emails from the team to a particular person as part of that process, some of the stakeholders, of which there was about 10 different internal stakeholders. And again, what we identified through mapping this process out is actually quite a few of these emails became white noise because through the process steps, they were getting so many different emails that actually they were just ignoring them. So again, if you map out your process in a way that can identify the complexity, it just really helps make sure that we can streamline and digitize and automate what we do in a much more kind of effective way, in a greater effective way. So how can we think about simple, complicated, and complex in relation to what we do with data process mapping? Well, we can try and keep it fairly simple. If we've mapped everything out and it's very kind of vertical with only a few points between it, it's a simple process. That'd be something like boiling a kettle. You basically put the kettle out, you put the water in, you put it back on the particular kind of like base, make sure that it's turned on at the wall, flick the switch, wait for the kettle to boil, and you've now got boiling water. And if you follow that simple process every time, you'll end up with a kettle full of boiled water, and you'll be safe because you haven't kind of held it against the side of the kettle while it's boiling, make sure it's hot. Something that's complicated is something that is still quite vertical, but there's just loads of steps in between it. So if we kind of keep the cooking theme on for a second, a baked Alaska is a really complicated recipe that has several different steps between it from start to finish that need to be completed in a linear process in order for that baked Alaska to come out the same every single time. Realistically, it's still vertical. There's actually very little deviation. There's very few violations that might occur as part of that particular recipe in order to get the baked Alaska. And finally, anything that's complex is horizontal. It's more dynamic. There's more kind of variables to think about. So I'm actually due twins later on this year. And if I was to apply raising those two kids in the same way, it might be a really challenging experience because one of them might completely ignore that particular process and need a particularly different approach in order to kind of basically just be raised in hopefully the best way possible for them. So there's a lot of complexity because it's more horizontal at that point. There's more things to consider. There's more variables attached to it. So simple, little vertical, complicated, big vertical, complex, big horizontal. That might also be part of a big vertical process as well. Now, hopefully this one should work a little better, but what I'm going to take you through very quickly is a health and safety process that's simplified using using Microsoft. So if you wouldn't mind, fingers crossed, this one will have you'll have access to it. If you could just scan that QR code and then pop that into your phones, that'd be really useful. If you don't have your phone out at the moment, if you just wouldn't mind copying this particular link that I'll pop in the chat, that would be much appreciated. Right, okay. So if you wouldn't mind, just click on that link and see if you can get access to this particular form. Just let me know in the chat if you can or can't. Amazing, right, cool, perfect. That's good on that, that's working. What I will say is if you just want to fill it out as much as kind of you want to as part of that, I'll quickly explain how it works. So for those of you who haven't kind of seen bits on Microsoft before, there's a few key things that you will have access to as part of your standard business account with Microsoft. Those are Microsoft Forms, Microsoft Power Automate, and Outlook. Now, fundamentally, that's basically just a form, an automation service, and your emails kind of behind it. Dead simple from that point of view. So what I'm going to do is quickly share my screen in a different way to just take us through what this looks like. So if you bear with me 1 second. All right, let's check this work. All right, perfect, amazing. So this is the back end of this particular form. And basically what we're doing with this is we're asking several questions to an open audience that ultimately gets kind of a hazard or a near miss record started with it. It's a Microsoft form. From a Power Automate point of view, this is where we've got our particular processes behind it. So if I go into Power Automate and click edit for this particular flow, I'll talk through what we're doing. We start on a very simple basis. We start with a trigger for someone submitting the form. I appreciate it's kind of loading in the background, so apologies for this. But we start with an automation that happens every time someone submits this particular form. Amazing. And then what it does is it gathers that form detail, it adds it to an Excel table, it gets the information from the table that we've just put in place because we've got a couple of VLOOKUPs that's attached to it. It adds it to a SharePoint list. And then what it's able to do is send out an email with a particular file that we want it to attach to that email relative to what someone's just submitted. And we then create several actions if they've said in that particular kind of submission that they've got certain actions that need to be completed associated with that with the form. So From a Power Automate point of view, we're barely scratching the surface here, but what we're actually doing is dramatically reducing the administration behind it. And if I zoom out, hopefully a bit with this, we can see that from that kind of simplicity point of view, if I just collapse these for a second, we've only got actually a few different steps here that we're doing. I think that there must only be kind of about 6 or 7 different steps. We're saying someone submits a form, put the details in an Excel table, put the details in a list, send them an email, and add 2 actions to a particular action tracker. Dead simple. So if I click then in the Excel sheet, we can see that actually, yeah, we've got 1 submission already that's come in there, but it's just slightly gone awry. So we just go through that and delete it to make sure that someone's been their bin is to get rid of the beehive, and it's been an unacceptable. It's amazing. So we can see that that's been submitted straight away. If we go over to our particular process, our kind of folder system that we have in SharePoint, what we'll also see is that I've put an additional flow that you couldn't see behind the scene to save a copy of that submission as a particular item in a folder. So if we were looking, for example, for evidence that we could trip non-conformances with, and we saw that our accident notifications, our hazards, our near misses were non-conformances, we can automatically put automation in place to just capture these automatically in a dedicated folder. If I kind of look here, this is then the action tracker that we've got on Microsoft Planner. Now, Microsoft Planner is almost kind of like an aggregated action tracker. And this is one that I've done, which talked about a tolerable drowning hazard that I'd submitted myself. And the action that's associated with this, because it's assigned to me, automatically goes to my to-do list, which then says what I need to do associated with that particular hazard. So again, all automatic from that point of view. But if we didn't like Microsoft Excel and we wanted it in a dedicated SharePoint list, we can just make sure that that's added there and everything's automatically tracked. So I'll just quickly refresh that, and hopefully it'll go to the bottom. Scroll down, and we should see, there we go, stung by a bee, and we've now those other couple of ones that are in there as well that have just been submitted. So there's a lot of different kind of things that we can do from an automation point of view. I say we're barely scratching the surface here, but when I was starting up a health and safety management system for multiple different sites, I really needed to make sure that everything that I was implementing had scalability attached to it. So having this administration that just worked in Microsoft in the background, oh my God, I'd say I could apply it for accidents, hazards, incidents, and near misses pretty much from kind of the first week that I was in the business. And it made my life so much easier because I could deal with the technical reactive issues that were going on, as well as in implementing the transformational stuff in kind of the side and the attached kind of processes that required to this. So I say we're barely scratching the surface, but getting out our information on our processes, in a data mapping exercise, linking it up to Power Automate and working through what we can do in Microsoft to reduce the administrative burden that we have as a function. Oh my God, makes life so much easier and can revolutionize how we can approach effective implementation of health and safety across our work. So, as I say, there's a lot that we can do, but if we kind of think about perhaps the 5 different areas to start with, have a look on your Microsoft account. Just go to literally just Microsoft Office online and have a look, see if you can access Microsoft Forms. Check out Power that can really be our 24/7 health and safety administrator in the background. Have a think about what type of tools you're using in 365 at the moment. Do you need stuff that's linking to Excel? Do you need lists? Do you need Planner? Do you need To-Do? What does your integration look like? And finally, explore, apologies, a little bit with some of the other things that Microsoft can do. Power BI is a wonderful tool. As a quick thing, if you drop me a message, have you come across Power BI before, by any chance? I can see a couple of people saying that they have, a couple of people that they haven't. Right, okay. If we imagine the health and safety kind of visualizations and often done in Excel, and we kind of create a number of different graphs type of stuff that we do, Power BI is effectively a dashboard for data that is kept in things like Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft Teams. It is wonderful. And you can basically set up automatic dashboards that you can kind of send to people on a weekly, monthly basis, however often you want, that automatically update every time someone kind of fills in extra information on those tables or in that kind of data list that you've got in SharePoint. AI Builder is a really cool bit of tech that's really useful for doing pulse surveys with. So I was working with a customer recently and we were doing a pulse survey for opinions of contractors that were working through their PQQ system. We used AI Builder to do automatic sentiment analysis of open text answers. So for example, imagine that you've got a pulse survey across 10,000 staff, how long it would take you to thematically analyze what those people were actually saying in there. You can do it instantly using AI Builder. It's a wonderful tool, and again, something that you've got limited access to for free straight away with your Microsoft account. Copilot I haven't touched upon, but that's kind of like the AI assistant, if you will, built into Microsoft that's permeating through a lot of these different apps that Microsoft now have on 365. Again, it's just kind of cursory awareness for Copilot will be really useful for the future. So what can we use Microsoft for in a health and safety management system? I really want to stress it doesn't matter what an in-house safety professional, if you're a functional director or a business owner, or if you're a consultant, there is a huge list of stuff that we can do with Microsoft on an A to Z basis. I literally ran out of space here when I got to M for a few things that I thought that we could do with Microsoft. But fundamentally, the sky's the limit, or realistically, imagination is the limit behind this. So definitely have a bit of a think, map out your processes, work through that A to Z system and see what you can achieve from that point of view. So in summary, what have we gone through so far? We've understood that thinking in frameworks allows us to design and scale our health and safety management systems, deploying and implementing them in an effective way. The key frameworks that we can use to guide us include organizational architecture, the risk fluent framework for operational success, objective, strategy, tactics, task, the fees across establish, embed, and evolve, elements of that implementation framework. My favorite part of that personally, and some bias on a biased basis, being time, quantity, quality, cost, capacity, culture, underpinned by capability. Thinking about inputs, outputs, and outcomes help establish these foundations in strong ways. Setting out a really simple visual governance structure can help us reiterate what we're trying to achieve for our key stakeholders. Going through that risk profile activity on an A to Z basis, again, helps visualize our risk management challenges for our stakeholders, as well as helping us structure and prioritize what we need to do for objectives and strategies, as well as understanding how that relates to our business values so that we don't have a two-tiered culture system. Complexity isn't the same as complication. Process maps can help us actually visualize and understand where our dead ends are in our processes. And again, if we're trying to describe simplicity versus complication versus complexity, the more horizontal a process is, the more complexity there is that's attached to it. The more vertical it is, the more complicated it can be. But realistically, a simple process is vertical and it's quite short from steps to steps. And then finally, Microsoft 365, it's ready for us to use. It's free to start with, and there's a boatload of stuff that we can do straight away to reduce the administrative burden that we have when we're trying to design and implement our health and safety management systems. Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Forms, Power Automate, and Excel will genuinely take you 90% of the way for what you need to do, especially when you're designing and starting out what you're trying to achieve across your business. So thank you very much for your time. I do have a bit of a feedback survey if you want to kind of let me know what your thoughts are. I'll pop a link to that in the chat as well. But for a second, I'm going to stop sharing, turn on my video, and hopefully the Welsh Wi-Fi that I have behind me will remain strong and I can answer any questions that you've got. So please, work away. Let me know what your questions are and I'll happily answer them. Right, stop sharing that. Perfect. I appreciate that there's a lot of messages that are coming through to hosts and panelists at the moment, just saying thank you. So I really do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Right, if I'll pop this feedback survey just quickly in the chat as well, if you just wouldn't mind bearing with me for 1 second. get that. So again, really appreciate the messages that people are popping in here. Thank you very much. It's very, very kind of you. So right, Brill. So that'll take you just through to a bit of the feedback form. If you wouldn't mind filling in that feedback form as well, what I'll do is I'll be able to share the risk fluent framework for operational success as part of that. If you just submit the feedback form and put an email address in, you'll actually get a free copy of that straight away. Well, perfect. Right. I think, fingers crossed, you should be able to see me in this small Welsh cottage that I'm in at the moment. Fingers crossed the Wi-Fi holds out for it.
Apologies, Peter, because I turned your camera off. Only I could turn it back on again.
Oh no, don't worry about that, Julie. That's not a problem. Not a problem. Well,
We've just had something
perfect.
come into
Right.
the chat
So
for
I've
you.
just, yeah, perfect. So the question that's come up at the moment is, what one bit of advice would you give to close the gap between startup in safety department and a company going through a huge change? Oh, that's a really great question. Okay. So there's two parts to this particular question that it's worthwhile kind of talking about in the context of maturity. So we've got a, oh, far disappeared, Julie, by any chance. Am I still here, Julie?
Yes, you are.
Okay, amazing. Sorry, apologies. It just disappeared on the monitor for a sec. Right. So from a maturity point of view, this is actually covered as well in the first 90 days, but we can think about business maturity in stars: startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, and sustaining success. So where we've got a function that's in startup, but a business is going through accelerated growth, realignment, or kind of potentially turnaround, we want to first think about what are the challenges associated with that business position. If someone's going through accelerated growth, chances are is that they need to make changes quickly, they need to make them effectively, and fundamentally, it doesn't matter necessarily who's going to do them, as long as they can do them effectively. They're focused on outputs, not necessarily outcomes. So to start with, when you're in startup, I'd recommend understand what your inputs and your outcomes are, and then understand what the business outputs need to be. And ultimately, try and marry those up together. It could be literally just as simple as a Venn diagram in some respects, just writing down inputs, outputs, outcomes. But then when you're drawing lines between the ones that are relevant, that line needs to represent a connection. It needs to kind of have some form of tangible definition associated with it. So if, for example, your business is going through growth, your function needs to improve accident records, it might be that you say, right, a risk performance indicator is actually going to be the number of accidents that we have, just as a standard lagging indicator. But you integrate that into your governance structure meetings to say, right, at a departmental level, we're going to understand where the accident's happening, when it's happening. But at a group level, I'm going to do some analysis to say, how has, for example, organizational factors really fit into this? How have the job factors at this stage of accelerated growth really deterred or kind of affected or ultimately caused that particular accident? So as simple as I could say, in your function, define what your key inputs need to be and what your outcomes want to be. And then as a business, really write down what the business outputs are and try and marry them up together. I appreciate that the person that's answered that is sending to hosts and panelists, but does that give you a bit of kind of extra information on that and hopefully is helpful? Perfect. Wonderful. Brilliant stuff. Are there any other questions that anyone has? Be more than happy to kind of talk it through in the last kind of minute that we've got. Okay, right, perfect. Nothing else, just a couple of thank you messages. So no, that's very, very much appreciated. Julie, is there anything that I can do for you before we potentially wrap up?
I don't think so, no. But if anybody does want to ask Peter a question, just message. I forgot what the email address is. Suddenly
Oh, no,
gone really blank.
no, that's all right. I tell you what, if anyone wants to drop me a message, if you want to just quickly drop me an email at peter@riskfluentlimited.com.
There we go.
I've just popped that
Perfect.
in the chat as well. Feel free to drop me a message. If you want connected with me on LinkedIn, please do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'd be more than happy to help. So brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity, Julie, to come on and speak with everyone today. It's been really, really, really good fun. So thank you.
You're more than welcome. And we did get over the broadband issue. Sorry, I had to switch the camera off halfway through. I didn't want
Don't
to lose
worry
your
about that.
voice, which is the most important thing. So
Not
thank
a
you,
problem.
everyone, for attending. As usual, we'll upload Peter's presentation onto the YouTube channel. It'll probably be early next week now, but I'll try and do it today if I can. And then you can share that with friends and colleagues as well. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you all had a great presentation. Sorry for the techie issues, but you can't really factor in broadband issues, can you, in the middle of
No,
nowhere?
unfortunately not.
So thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and we'll see you at the next Southeast Branch meeting. Goodbye, everyone.
Wonderful. Cheers. Thank you, everyone. Take care.